Like the ruins of a vanished civilization, the old wooden piers lie derelict on the waterfront. Now they are the property of the seabirds and the harbor seals. Yet there was a time when these docks were coveted by kings and haunted by pirates, gangsters, and revolutionaries. From one power struggle to the next, a kind of raw history unfolds here.
It really is a frontier. Culturally, it's a frontier. Economically, it's a frontier. Socially, it's a frontier. And that frontier is an explosive one.
This is where the pirate Blackbeard ransomed a city for a chest of medicine, where an outrageous act of defiance launched the American Revolution, and where San Francisco's longshoremen fought a momentous battle called Bloody Thursday.
They're going to open the waterfront. Now that means with cops, it means with tear gas, it means with billy clubs, it means with herding scabs onto the waterfront.
In New York, there was no open warfare on the docks, but the slow burn terror of entrenched corruption, extortion, and murder, which became the inspiration for a Hollywood landmark on the waterfront.
You wanted my philosophy of life? Do it to him before he does it to you.
A rich and disturbing history is tattooed into these rotting timbers. The docks are littered with secrets to our past. When the Roman Empire was still young, the reputation of the waterfront was already ancient. It was known as a place of lawlessness and danger. Its notoriety helped to shape the map of civilization. Rome and the other great city-states were built at a distance from the sea for protection against pirate attacks and slave raids. But along the coast were the rollicking harbor towns perched on the edge of infinity.
It's the sense of the harbor being the gate to the unknown world that the farmers would never see because they would never leave their towns. That unknown world out there.
The port city of Ostia was once located at the nexus of empire, the mouth of the Tiber River. Now, it's separated from the sea by miles of landfill. But its temples and taverns are remarkably intact, allowing a vivid glimpse into daily life on the ancient waterfront. Much of that life revolved around the taverns and whorehouses, which were used as hotels by traveling merchants and sailors. You found your way by signs of an unmistakable nature. When you arrived, you bribed your way in with a few coins to the old prostitute at the door. And once inside, you'd find a motley cross-section of empire, from runaway slaves to slumming aristocrats.
We have a description of Nero getting into this tavern culture, trying to pretend that he's not emperor for the night, milling around with gangs of ruffians and beating up people in the streets. And he stumbles upon a Roman senator with his entourage and gets beaten up and black-eyed. And the next day the senator sees him there on the throne with a black eye and remembers him.
Port cities such as Ostia have set the tone for the waterfront throughout history, a place where criminality goes hand in hand with commerce. A place both of physical danger and dangerous ideas carried on the winds of trade.
Sailors were the bearers of many different kinds of information and knowledge. Sailors themselves are a multicultural lot. So in some ways, they predict the future, the ways in which the continents are going to be connected.
Across the centuries and into the age of exploration, wherever port cities appeared, so did pirates. By the early 1700s, your first impression of the docks would be a grisly one.
One of the first things that we would note would be the putrefying corpse of 1 or 2 or 3 pirates hanging in chains in some prominent place in the harbor.
These scarecrow remains served as a warning to all would-be pirates. At first, the warning was ignored. The Jolly Roger was an even more powerful symbol than the gallows. For generations, pirates had operated with near impunity on the high seas. The golden age of piracy, as it was called, was in full sail. Pirates not only ruled the seas, but had their way on the waterfront. There were merchants who fenced their stolen goods, and spies who tipped them off to rich cargoes.
The communications in these days are amazing. Without telephone and so forth, somehow the word got around very rapidly. And other ships would hear about, bring the message in, and they would be waiting for a certain vessel to come in with certain goods aboard.
The British Crown itself was responsible for the open scandal of piracy. Draconian laws had been passed in order to establish British trade monopolies. In response, merchants on both sides of the Atlantic began trading openly with smugglers and pirates. It was literally a thieves' market.
A huge percentage of the population in England and America smoked smuggled tobacco, ate smuggled sugar, drank smuggled rum.
Besides greed, there was another reason why sailors turned pirate. The alternative had become intolerable. Seamen in the British Navy or merchant service were overworked, poorly fed, and miserably paid. They were often enlisted by force. Armed press gangs cruised the docks, capturing men to round out a ship's crew. One moment, you were at your job. The next moment, you were on your way to a warship in chains and into a service that was considered the equivalent of slavery. By comparison, life aboard a pirate ship was one of liberty and luxury.
Pirates just did things differently. How did they do things differently? The captain got 2 shares of the booty, and the lowest common sailor got 1. Now, on a man-of-war, the captain might make 60 times as much as the lowest seaman. On a merchant vessel, it would usually be 6 to 10 times as much as the lowest seaman.
In the early 1700s, however, the British lion awakened and began to roar along the waterfront. For in 1713, the English signed a far-reaching peace accord with Spain. The way was now open for trade with Spanish colonies in the Americas.
Pirates were interfering now with this lucrative new possibility. And this is the point at which the English state begins a campaign of extermination, and they hang pirates by the hundreds.
For the pirate hunters, the greatest trophy would be the severed head of the man who was said to be unkillable. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was the most famous outlaw afloat.
Edward Teach is a fascinating figure who had a distinctly modern understanding that image mattered. He cultivated an image of himself as a violent tyrant, as a man somehow larger than life, and that image has survived. Before going into battle, he would tie up the strands of his long black beard and put what are really the equivalent of sparklers into his beard, which then created this kind of halo, a glow around his head as he made his way in battle. It was very eerie.
Until 1718, Blackbeard was relatively unknown. Then came the daring raid that vaulted him to lasting fame, but also helped to spell the end of his kind. One steamy day in June, the waterfront of Charleston, South Carolina, was seized with terror. Blackbeard had sailed his pirate fleet to the mouth of Charleston Harbor and began to capture all outgoing ships, in effect, blockading the South's largest port. Next, he threatened to pound the city into splinters with his 40-odd cannon. And then came a unique demand. It wasn't for gold, it wasn't for rum. What Blackbeard required to lift the blockade was a sea chest of medicine. The malady that Blackbeard's crew suffered from is unknown, although it may have been fever or syphilis. Charleston sweated out the siege for 3 days before caving in to the pirates' extortion. The chest of medicine was delivered and the blockade duly lifted. But Blackbeard had achieved a dangerous celebrity. From Charleston, the pirate fled to the safety of the labyrinthine inlets of the North Carolina coast. There, he could also depend on the protection of high-level friends. Blackbeard was known as a spirited dinner companion who frequented the table of many a wealthy planter. In one colony to the north, however, Blackbeard had a powerful adversary. The governor of Virginia was Alexander Spotswood, a man who had little use for pirates, or America for that matter. By going after Blackbeard, Spotswood figured he might win a royal post back in London. Spotswood commissioned a warship to pursue Blackbeard's flotilla. Waterfront spies directed the hunters to Ocracoke Bay, North Carolina, and the hidden lair of the pirate.
He got caught at low tide when he could not get over a sandbar, and he was caught. And he put up one whale of a battle. There were like 22 bullet holes in them, how many stab wounds in them. But here was a man that did not want to die. And the legend even goes on that after they beheaded him, he threw his body over and the body swam around the ship several times.
As proof of the deed, Blackbeard's head was delivered to Governor Spotswood. But in death, the pirate haunted the governor. Spotswood grew terrified of sea travel for the chance of running into a confederate of Blackbeard's who would avenge the pirate's death. Having eliminated Blackbeard and other prominent outlaws, the Crown now took aim at their waterfront connections. In 1721, a law was enacted that made it a hanging offense to trade with pirates. Now, the grim reminders strung in chains along the waterfront were meant not only for pirates, but for merchants as well.
By the late 1720s, it's difficult for pirates to find people to take their goods because the risks are so high. There are bodies of hanged pirates dangling in almost every port city as a warning to everyone, this will happen to you if you deal with pirates.
In the end, the gallows prevailed. By the 1730s, the Jolly Roger was seldom seen on the waterfront. But the crimes against empire that had been conducted in its name had left a permanent mark.
They were heroes to these ordinary working people on the waterfront. because they gathered up all their courage, and they dared to take that step that might get them hanged, and their bodies might be there dangling, but they were freer. They had managed to do things, even if for a short time, that all those people on the waterfront would respect and would know about and would tell stories about.
Although piracy had been suppressed, the spirit of rebellion still simmered. And those who would bring it to a boil would also be called outlaws, until they were called patriots. The Docks will return here on the History Channel. We now return to the docks, trouble on the waterfront. The year was 1747, and the old evil of the waterfront was abroad in Boston. The press gang. Sweeping the docks for able-bodied men to force into service aboard a British warship. Impressment was more than coerced labor. It was often a death sentence. Mortality rates in the disease-ridden holds of British ships were as high as 50%.
Impressment was something that terrorized the waterfront. If you were rounded up by a press gang, there was a very real chance you would never see your family, never see your friends or loved ones again.
But this was one press gang that would be cheated of its victims. A crowd of waterfront workers overpowered the gang and arrested the officer in charge. This act of defiance touched off a riot involving several thousand people and pushed the city to the brink of war.
Captain Knowles has pulled his warship alongside and is ready to bombard the city of Boston. So angry is he about all this because these sailors have actually captured one of his lieutenants. This is probably the single biggest urban uprising in America until the 1760s and the coming of the Revolution. You could almost call it an urban insurrection.
Rather than incite the crowd further, the warship left Boston without firing a shot and without the victims of the press gang. But the lasting effect of the Knowles riot, as it was called, was the impression it made on a young Bostonian. Samuel Adams was the son of a brewer who had a passion for politics. Adams himself despised the beer profession and eventually ran the family business into bankruptcy. But he did take to his father's waterfront taverns, which were places for discourse as well as drinking. News from abroad reached the docks first, allowing Sam Adams and his tavern mates the chance to give it a political spin.
One of his enemies, political opponents, said he was very cunning with the lowlife, which meant that he understood people like waterfront workers very well.
After he witnessed the desperate violence of the press gang riot, Adams began to write in a new political language.
They have the right to resist tyranny. They have the right to resist enslavement. How do they have that right? It's a natural right of man. Up until this time, the customary way to talk about rights would be in terms of the rights of Englishmen. But Sam Adams talks about natural rights, rights of man.
What Adams was beginning to glean from his waterfront connections was that the colonies were ripe for rebellion. While Sam Adams ran with the rabble, John Hancock was in the inner circle of waterfront power. The young man who favored lavender suits and cultivated an exquisite signature had inherited a vast shipping empire from his uncle. By the standards of King George III, the Hancock fortune was ill-gotten. The Hancocks were notorious smugglers. Unlike the shadowy black market of the pirates, colonial smuggling was practiced on a grand scale. In open defiance of British law, tea was shipped directly from Asia and rum from the Caribbean. When the Crown tried to crack down on smugglers in 1768, Hancock was a prominent target. Customs officials seized a Hancock ship, the Liberty, which was loaded with contraband wine. Hancock's sailors retaliated by beating a Crown official and burning his private yacht. It was the Liberty riot that prompted the British to send troops to Boston. The presence of the so-called Bloody Backs provoked even more rage along the waterfront. Still more riots and violence followed, including the Boston Massacre. By December 1773, the stage was set for a monumental event on the waterfront, the Boston Tea Party. In his old age, a shoemaker named George Twelves Hughes told of his participation in the Tea Party. With 3,000 others, Hughes had attended a riotous gathering at the Old South Meeting House. At one point, Samuel Adams rose from his chair and shouted, "There is nothing more we can do to save the country." The meeting broke up as John Hancock cried, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." That night, George Twelves Hughes joined the crowd that disguised themselves as Indians and descended on Griffin's Wharf to the ships laden with East India tea. According to Hughes, he stood next to John Hancock as they heaped tea into Boston Harbor.
George Hughes says, "Well, yeah, I saw the ruffles of his shirt peeking out from underneath his costume, and I knew it was him. We were chopping on the same cask of tea together."
This odd coincidence of history was a defining moment of early America. The wealthy shipping magnate and the poor shoemaker, for a moment at least, were equals.
So there's another source of credibility for someone like Hancock. He may be a man of property, but he was willing to take action against it. Direct action at that.
The Tea Party so angered George III that he closed Boston Harbor. Soon after came the first shots of the Revolutionary War. In future conflicts, yet another predator would join the pirates and smugglers of the waterfront, the war profiteer. And one of the most notorious of the kind emerged during the Civil War and the federal occupation of New Orleans. Most of the world's cotton once flowed from the steamboats of the Mississippi riverfront. The Union blockade had all but stopped the cotton trade. Then, New Orleans fell to Union gunboats in the spring of 1862. Though one of the least bloody of Civil War battles, it was a mortal blow to the South.
First of all, the South lost its largest city and its richest city. It also severed the Confederacy in half, and this was Lincoln's idea. It also lost its foreign support because New Orleans had these foreign consuls and diplomats who were actually siding with the South before its fall of New Orleans, that they wanted that valuable cotton.
New Orleans now braced itself for occupation. The proud old city with the European airs anticipated a certain gentility from the occupying forces. Instead, she got Ben Butler. Major General Benjamin Butler was known for his bloodhound looks and his lack of military ability. He was not missed in the field when he was placed in charge of occupied New Orleans. Soon, he showed his true calling, which was that of a war profiteer. Naturally, Butler set his designs on King Cotton and began to plunder the secret passageways of the waterfront. The general began soliciting large bribes from cotton smugglers. Butler's own brother began trading across enemy lines for the enormously valuable fiber. Butler also had an ingenious scheme for shipping Southern sugar. Union troop ships would usually arrive on the riverfront full of soldiers, then return north with a ballast of sand. Butler substituted tons of sugar for the sand, which he sold for an immense profit. As Butler looted the New Orleans riverfront, he brought out the worst in its citizens.
Butler was riding down one of the streets in the French Quarter with an aide when he heard some sneers up from a balcony, and he turned up to look. And at that time, there were about 5 or 6 ladies up on the balcony who conveniently turned around, flipped up the back of their dresses, and showed him their bottoms. Well, Butler looked and kind of laughed to his aide and said, "Well, I guess those women evidently know which end of them is the best." And he laughed it off. But several days later, Admiral Farragut was walking down the same streets, and he had the contents of a chamber pot thrown on him from one of the balconies. This did not amuse Ben Butler.
Butler retaliated with his infamous woman order, which made it illegal for women to insult Union officers. In the language of the order, offenders would be subject to treatment as a woman of the town plying her avocation. From the docks of New Orleans all the way to London, this was interpreted as an open invitation to rape Southern women. Southerners began calling him Beast Butler. He was recalled from his post after a multitude of complaints from foreign officials stationed in New Orleans. But he had had a prosperous 2 years on the riverfront.
Ben Butler's net worth prior to the Civil War was $150,000. Following the Civil War in 1868, his net worth was almost $3 million. And following 1 year later, after the death of his brother, who was also a corrupt accomplice in New Orleans, his fortune was worth over $7 million.
Wild tycoons like John Hancock and tyrants like Benjamin Butler made millions, rank-and-file longshoremen continued to live in desperate poverty. And no measure of justice would come until the 20th century, when blood was spilled on the San Francisco waterfront. The Docks will return here on the History Channel. We now return to the docks, trouble on the waterfront. In the taverns, alleyways, and flop houses of the old waterfront, the cry was heard, "Men along the shore! Men along the shore!" This was the signal that a ship had been sighted in the harbor and that workers were needed at the docks. Men along the shore was later abbreviated to longshoremen, specialists in the art of loading odd-sized cargo into symmetrical ships.
How do you load a locomotive? How do you load a tank into the hull of a ship? You've got to do it right, because if they do it wrong, what can follow is disaster. Because once it's out there on the ocean, if there's a slippage in that cargo, that ship goes down.
A longshoreman was typically a former sailor who had abandoned the sea, but not the waterfront. He saw all the sins of the docks and was known to indulge in them, if only for his habit of occasionally filching a bottle from the hold.
I knew guys all beat out by hard work. I mean, you know, you're talking about weather-beaten, scarred veterans, you know. They knew more about good booze than the guy that's running the Fairmont Hotel. 'Cause they ain't been doing nothing but drinking the best it is for years. And I remember two guys getting into a big squawk about what champagne to have when they had conger eel to go with it.
Yet a free bottle of booze didn't make up for a grim reality. Longshoremen were among the most exploited of American workers. What they hated most was the way they were hired. It was called the shape-up. Crowds of men looking for a day's work would compete for the attention of the corrupt dock bosses, whose favors came at a price.
You know, a guy'd say, you know, like, "What, you here again for a job?" He said, "Well, I need work." I said, "Well, why should I hire you? You don't eat at my cafe, and you don't drink in my bar, and you don't come see my whore girls." I said, "Why the hell should I give you a job?" So you get the idea.
Yet there would come a time when these misunderstood and mistrusted workers would dictate terms to the shipping barons, when the underdogs of American labor would become the top dogs of the waterfront. The San Francisco waterfront has long been known by the Spanish word embarcadero. Its series of long wharves and mission-style facades are as distinctive as the city's cable cars. The Embarcadero's centerpiece is the graceful clock tower of the ferry building, where crowds of commuters once jostled past thousands of longshoremen. Dock workers had their own name for the Embarcadero. They called it the Slave Mart. The shape-up here was a notoriously brutal one. Men who were not hired by 8 a.m. were often chased off the Embarcadero by San Francisco police, swinging their billy clubs. Since gold rush times, longshore work was controlled by an elite union called the stevedores and riggers. When the docks were piled sky high with cargo bound for the gold country and skilled men were scarce, longshoremen were calling the shots. But in the labor surplus following World War I, the union was out.
They got their ears pinned back in a serious strike in 1919 after the war, and basically the union was destroyed. At that point, the Blue Book Union came into existence. That's a company union. That's all it is, a company union. I mean, it was like the bottom of the heap.
The Blue Book Union was named for the blue leather covers on the work logs that the men carried in their pockets. It was a return to the Stone Age of labor. The speed up came to the docks. Employers staged races between longshore gangs as they worked their respective holds. As longshoremen tired, they were summarily replaced by fresh bodies from the shape-up. As fatigue increased, so did injuries. Longshoring was second only to coal mining as the most dangerous profession in America. Falling cargo could crush a man. A loose winch line could cut him in half.
The injury rate on the waterfront was extraordinarily high. One estimate was that there were as many serious injuries on the waterfront over a year's time as there were longshoremen.
Well, I'm telling you, man, you'd be a husk of a fella by the time you're 35 working under them conditions. That's like, you know, you're a draft animal, for Christ's sake.
In 1920, a young merchant seaman from Australia jumped ship at San Francisco. His name was Harry Bridges. As a young man, Harry had rejected his middle-class roots and embraced the leftist Labour Party of Australia. Then he had gone to sea. Sailors were a notoriously radical lot, and many at that time were members of the industrial workers of the world. Bridges himself became a so-called wobbly later on, after he had shipped out for California. He'd read Jack London's adventure novels and always wanted to see the countryside that London was writing about. In the way of many merchant seamen who returned to land, Bridges became a longshoreman. Unlike most men of the craft, he was skinny, the result of chronic stomach ulcers. Yet he was able to pull his weight in the hold. He became popular as both a bare-knuckle longshoreman and a hardline union man. By the spring of 1934, he had something to hide, something that could easily get him deported. Bridges had secretly become a member of the American Communist Party. At the same time came the opportunity for longshoremen to break the hated Blue Book Union. Labor now had a friend in the White House named Roosevelt, and Congress was passing laws guaranteeing the right to organize. One of the first tests of the legislation came on the docks of San Francisco. The International Longshoremen's Association, or ILA, sent members to a Blue Book shape-up.
So here's half a dozen guys down at Matson Dock one morning, show up, got a union button on, ILA union button. They get the heave-ho. They get fired for their trouble right off the bat. That's the first case to go to the labor commissioner, because that ain't right no more. Well, damned if they didn't win it. And when they won it, they burned them blue books and everybody put an ILA button on.
The New York-based ILA was an old-line conservative union, but when it organized on Pacific docks, a radical faction led by Harry Bridges seized control. A strike vote was taken and won. Bridges was elected strike committee chairman for the San Francisco local. On May 9, 1934, longshoremen walked off the docks the entire length of the Pacific coast. Though only a local officer, Bridges soon found himself in the spotlight.
The strike centered on San Francisco almost immediately. San Francisco was the largest port. It was also where the headquarters of most of the shipping companies were located. And thus, events in San Francisco had an importance that was out of all proportion to the fact that it was only one port on the whole coast.
The most bitterly contested issue of the strike was the shape-up. Longshoremen wanted to eliminate the shape and replace it with a clean hiring hall run by the union. But union officials from the East Coast, who made millions off kickbacks from the shape-up, were not ready for that much reform. ILA President Joe Ryan came in from New York to negotiate an end to the walkout. He struck a deal that included higher wages and shorter working hours, but kept the shape-up. Bridges and his supporters felt they had been sold out. They rejected the contract and the union president.
There is a big meeting in San Francisco where one after another of the rank and file stands up and criticizes Joe Ryan. Joe Ryan finally finds it best to leave town. There are threats to his life. He's told, you go back to New York or you'll go back in a box.
It was at this time, according to Bridges, that he was offered a large bribe by the ship owners to back off. Bridges joked that he briefly considered accepting the money, if only to plow it back into the union's strike fund. And the strike dragged on. As it approached its third month, employers decided to flex their muscle. They bought a fleet of trucks and hired an army of strikebreakers.
They're going to open the waterfront. Now that means with cops, it means with tear gas, it means with billy clubs, it means with herding scabs onto the waterfront.
Throughout the day of July 3rd, tension mounted along the Embarcadero. Angry longshoremen crowded the approaches to the piers, where scabs loaded cargo onto company trucks. As trucks rolled off the piers, some were overturned by strikers. Police fired canisters of an experimental chemical weapon called vomit gas into the crowd. Several people were injured. As longshoremen tended to their wounded, there was an uneasy quiet all along the waterfront. It lasted through the evening of July 3rd and the holiday of Wednesday, the 4th of July. But it would explode into violence the next day, Thursday, July 5th. Bloody Thursday. The Docks will return here on the History Channel. We now return to the docks, trouble on the waterfront. On July 5th, 1934, San Franciscans were badly in need of a cup of coffee. For 3 months, all imports, including tons of green coffee, had been tied up due to a waterfront strike. But in the morning shadow of the Bay Bridge, which was then under construction, scab trucks loaded with coffee were ready to move out. The ship owners, backed by the police, were prepared to use force to win back the docks. Longshoremen were ready to risk their lives to keep them. As the trucks rolled out onto the Embarcadero, several hundred strikers moved in, tipping over the vehicles before being driven back by police with their rifles. the Embarcadero became a war zone. Everywhere the trucks rolled, longshoremen let fly with bricks and bottles. Police counterattacked with tear gas and the new vomit gas. One of the gas shells hit a striker directly in the head, apparently killing the man. The officer who fired the shot said, "As he was a communist, I have no feeling in the matter, and I'm sorry that I did not get more." Two blocks from the Embarcadero, the long day of violence reached its climax. The police tactic was to herd the main body of strikers against a sheer bluff called Rincon Hill. By early afternoon, longshoremen were pinned between the hill and a concrete support for the Bay Bridge. The strikers were cornered. They turned and fought back. A police cruiser soon roared into the melee. Two lawmen got out of the car and, without warning, fired into the crowd. Then came gunfire all along the blue line.
There was over 100 guys shot. 2 of them killed.
Resistance melted away before the shock of gunfire. The Battle of Rincon Hill, as it was called, was over. Using chalk, workers outlined the spot where the two men fell, along with the words, "Police murder, 2 ILA men killed, shot in the back." Shortly after this photograph was taken, police destroyed the memorial. It was quickly remade by strikers. 2 days later, longshoremen defied an order against assembly to stage a mass funeral procession for the dead strikers, their caskets borne on an open bed truck.
Behind the truck marched rank after rank of longshoremen and sailors, all the maritime workers that were on strike, all the strike supporters, in a silent march that filled Market Street from one end almost all the way to the other.
The longshoremen strike had shut down ports up and down the coast. Now, other unions followed suit. In San Francisco, nearly every tradesman walked off the job in sympathy with the longshoremen. Soon, the city was in the grip of a general strike, only the second in American history.
Movie Tone is covering a waterfront where it's not so quiet these days. It's the worst industrial disturbance that San Francisco has seen in many years. Motor transit is completely demoralized through inability of gas stations to replenish their supplies. With vital stores in the grip of strikers, signs such as this are typical displays.
Hoarders descended on stores. Everywhere else, the city was quiet, as in the aftermath of one of San Francisco's periodic earthquakes.
Now the right of dissatisfied men to strike against a recalcitrant employer is inviolate. But the general strike is quite another matter. There is a menace to government. That is civil war.
The governor declared martial law and ordered 2,400 National Guardsmen to take up posts along the waterfront with tanks and machine guns. Then came another wave of terror. Right-wing vigilantes who were often financed by big business were common in California in the 1930s. During the general strike, they swept through the docks, beating up strikers and setting fire to union halls. After 3 days, the general strike collapsed. the warring parties submitted to arbitration. In a San Francisco hearing room, the contest was just as bitter as on the docks. Harry Bridges and other union leaders refused to back down on a single demand. The ship owners also refused to compromise, but it was they who would blink first. For when arbitration was awarded in October 1934, it was a decisive victory for the longshoremen.
Doggone, they won virtually everything they asked for. Key to it was the hiring hall, because the hiring hall meant everybody equal now, and you take the jobs in rotation. There ain't no favoritism, there ain't no corruption, there ain't no payoff, there ain't nothing.
Gone was the demeaning shape-up and the deadly speed-up. The longshoremen were now firmly in possession of the Pacific Coast waterfront.
You know, it's like the aristocracy of labor, for crying out loud. I mean, you know, it's like good paying job and you hold your head up.
By the mid-1930s, the San Francisco longshoremen had begun referring to themselves as the lords of the docks.
But with the changing of the guard on the Pacific Coast came dark allegations of a communist conspiracy. The ship owners, having failed to corrupt Harry Bridges, now tried to have him deported as a dangerous alien and communist. Red Harry, he was called. But Bridges was always cagey about his party affiliation.
Throughout his long life, he pronounced himself a Marxist. Throughout his life, he expressed sympathy for the Soviet Union and the Communist Party. Throughout his life, he was accused of being a communist, and he always denied it, although we now know from records that have become available in Moscow since the collapse of the Soviet Union that, in fact, he held important leadership positions within the Communist Party.
As there was no hard evidence at the time, Bridges beat 4 separate attempts to ship him back to Australia. In 1937, West Coast longshoremen formalized the split with their East Coast brethren. They formed the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, or ILWU. The new union became a strong voice of political dissent. Before World War II, they refused to load cargo bound for Italy and Japan, saying the scrap iron they loaded would come back at them in the form of bullets. Then, during the McCarthy era, the union became a safe haven from the blacklist.
The ILWU was one of a few unions that refused to play that game. And in keeping with its earliest traditions, the ILWU took the position that somebody's race and somebody's politics could not and would not be used as a criterion for excluding them from membership. So we received into the ILWU many refugees from McCarthyism.
While the Pacific Coast Union favored the political left, the East was a stronghold of the right. ILA President Joseph Ryan was a strident anti-communist. But Ryan's patriotism was mostly a pose. Word was that the fatherly labor boss had gone far beyond the usual waterfront corruption into an unholy alliance with the sinister operatives of Murder Incorporated. The Docks will return here on the History Channel.